So before I knew it, my publisher of my first book, Simon & Schuster, was asking me to do a second book, a season inside a team that was just on the verge. You just knew it was on the verge, a very talented but too young team, the 1992 Dallas Cowboys. And guess what that book turned into? It sort of wrote itself. It ran away from me. It turned into Jerry versus Jimmy, behind the scenes. I was there. That book was ironically titled The Boys. Not really. That book ends with a prediction that the town wasn't big enough for the both of them, that they wouldn't last much longer together, that either Jerry would fire Jimmy or Jimmy would just up and quit. Of course, that 92 team broke through a year early and won the Super Bowl. And now I was coming out with a book that predicted the owner would fire the head coach. A book that was competing in bookstores with that head coach's. Ain't I a great book about how he had turned everything around from 1-15. In fact, his book, Jimmy's book, was called Turning the Thing Around. What? Lord have mercy on me. Cowboy Nation was not happy with me. None of this had been reported until I reported it, even though everything I wrote in that book was dead on the money. You can see it now. Nobody wanted to see it then. Nobody wanted to hear it then. Nobody. Even my book editor initially took exception with my opening scene in that book. You can check it out if you so desire. But it was Jerry blowing through the locker room door after the final regular season game of 1992. Just as Jimmy was addressing the team, here came Jerry leading Prince Bandar, Saudi Arabia's ambassador to the United States. Prince Bandar and his entire entourage, including all the security, right through the door and into the post-game locker room. And my opening scene had Jimmy stopping in mid-sentence as he spoke to the team and storming out of the locker room and throwing a fit and threatening to quit right then and there, and finally cursing out Jerry later that evening at a post-game gathering for coaches upstairs in the stadium. Cursed him out. All that happened before the 92 playoffs even got started. I'm just not sure my editor really ever believed it was that bad between Jimmy and Jerry. My editor initially wanted me to lead that book with Jimmy blowing up at the team on the plane coming back from a December loss in Washington, a story that had already been reported, but one that added fuel to the blazing legend that had become Jimmy Johnson, the national legend of Jimmy Johnson. At that point, Jimmy was at least as big a national star as Troy or Emmett or Michael had become up to that point as they first broke through. But my editor was sure right about one thing. Cowboy Nation did not want to hear anything about Jimmy versus Jerry, even though I just knew that was the story. But Cowboy Nation's reaction to the boys was, what? This is more outlandish shock jock lies from Skip Bayless. It got so bad for me after that book came out in July, just ahead of the next year's training camp, the 93 training camp, that around, I don't know, is the 1st of September, I was on the Sunday morning show on ESPN, The Sports Reporters, Dick Schaap show, the late, great Dick. When on air, I reiterated that I just doubted Jimmy and Jerry would last much longer. And in the next commercial break, my producer came on the speaker that everyone in the studio could hear and just, with a booming voice of God, just called me out, just laughed at me in front of everybody, said I was crazy if I truly believed Jerry Jones was going to fire the hottest coach in pro football, Jimmy Johnson. What is wrong with you? And I shrugged and I said, I know what I've seen. I had seen Jimmy ban me from all Cowboy facilities for daring to give Jerry any credit in my book. And by the way, I definitely gave Jerry credit for ramrodding that trade with the 49ers for Charles Haley, a trade Jimmy was hesitant to make because he feared Charles was just uncoachable. As I said in that book, and as everybody says now, no way the Cowboys win that Super Bowl without Charles Haley. And now Troy Aikman, as he said the other night on Monday Night Football, he says that he wouldn't have any of his 3 rings without Charles Haley. I second that emotion. And on opening day of camp in 1993, I had seen Jerry make a beeline right past Jimmy standing out in the middle of the practice field and come straight over to me standing on the sidelines and say to me, as long as I own this team, you will be welcome in all of our facilities. That's what Jerry Jones said to me. Yes, sir, I had seen Jerry show Jimmy who was boss in full view of all the players and many media members standing along the sideline. But of course, the Cowboys won a second straight Super Bowl in 1993, and I guess I looked like a complete idiot for a little while until shortly thereafter at the league meetings, Jerry decided he'd finally had enough of Jimmy's ridicule and scorn, and he fired his ass. Look, this is just me. Final takeaway, Jimmy's a scoundrel. He's a con artist. He's a media deceiver. In the end, deep down, not a nice guy. I didn't think the documentary went quite deeply enough into how many times in front of assistant coaches and other front office staffers, Jimmy just shamed Jerry to his face, just shamed him for trying to play GM and for taking credit and for doing so many interviews. Jimmy could not stand it that he had paid his coaching dues starting as an assistant at Picayune, Mississippi High School, and that Jerry had struck it rich and bought his way into owning and operating an NFL team. Really, owning and operating the NFL team. Look, I certainly appreciated that from Jimmy. I got it. But here's what Jimmy really couldn't live with. This is it. This is the crux. As long as he coached the Dallas Cowboys, he would have a boss. He was never going to be the boss. And Jimmy could only shame that boss so many times, especially in front of assistant coaches that Jerry admired and wanted to kind of be part of that assistant coach fraternity, one of the boys. Look, I've said many times that Jimmy Johnson could create a locker room force field unlike any coach I have ever been around, and I've been around a bunch of great ones. Jimmy could create a force field out of which championships could spring, create a force field that kept players on razor's edge because they were scared to death of Jimmy's psycho temper. He could create a force field that was finite, that might have lasted maybe a couple of more years in Dallas because, look, that force field was going to burn him out along with all the players and all the coaches and everyone else around Hurricane Jimmy. It was going to be finite, and maybe it had already run its course after 2 Super Bowls. But here's the point. I'll say this again. Jimmy's football acumen wasn't all that much greater than Jerry's. Jimmy didn't believe in Troy Aikman for the first 3 years he had him. First 3 years, Jimmy drafted Steve Walsh #1 in the supplemental draft. Jimmy stuck with Steve Berline at quarterback down the stretch of the 91 season and into the playoffs, even after Troy Aikman got healthy. Norv Turner was Jimmy's 8th attempt to hire a new offensive coordinator, and it was Norv, who was only the receivers coach with the Rams, who turned around Troy's career. How lucky was Jimmy to stumble into hiring Norv? Seriously, how lucky?